September 4th, 1977. Ewing Township, New Jersey. The nude body of 25-year-old graduate student Sigrid Stevenson is discovered beneath a piano cover inside the main stage theater of Kendall Hall on the campus of Trenton State College. She has been bludgeoned to death with a blunt object, and since Sigrid had been staying in Kendall Hall that weekend, she was likely attacked while practicing the piano. A number of people are looked at as potential suspects, including campus police officers, campus staff, and members of a theater group, but there is no conclusive evidence to implicate any of them, and Sigrid's murder remains unsolved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Mortar, and today we're going to be covering a cold case which was recently featured on the Netflix reboot of Unsolved Mysteries, the 1977 murder of Sigrid Stevenson. This is the horrific and tragic story of a piano prodigy from California who was pursuing a master's degree at Trenton State College, but while preparing for her second semester there, she was brutally murdered on campus inside the main theater at Kendall Hall. Since Sigrid did not have another place to stay at the time, she decided to spend Labor Day weekend there, but it appeared that while she was in the midst of practicing the piano on stage, she was attacked and fatally bludgeoned by an unknown assailant. No one was supposed to be in Kendall Hall on that particular day, but there were a handful of people who were aware that Sigrid would be alone there, lending credence to the idea that she was murdered by someone she knew. There was no shortage of potential suspects, including officers from the campus police and other college staff, as well as members of a theater group who had performed a play in Kendall Hall while Sigrid was there on the night before the crime. But while many of these individuals were investigated, no evidence has ever been found to conclusively implicate any of them. For decades, this case completely faded from the spotlight and was pretty much treated as a ghost story on campus, as rumors circulated that Sigrid's restless spirit haunted Kendall Hall, and her murder seemed to be more of an urban legend than an actual crime. However, in recent years, there has been a serious push to solve this case, and a lot of people now have a vested interest in bringing Sigrid's killer to justice. The aforementioned Unsolved Mysteries episode, titled Murder Center Stage, clarified a lot of key details about this crime which had never been made public before, and presented a number of theories involving potential suspects, so I think now's a good time to feature this case on our podcast. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has over 80 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on our regular feed. So with all of that out of the way, let us now delve into the murder of Sigrid Stevenson. Our story begins in Ewing Township, New Jersey in 1977, and our central figure is 25-year-old Sigrid Stevenson. Sigrid was born in Livermore, California to parents Peter and Barbara Stevenson, and also had a younger sister named Sylvia. From a very young age, Sigrid was considered to be a piano prodigy, as she spent several hours practicing every week, and had a gift for being able to learn and play any new piece of music that was handed to her within minutes. Following high school, Sigrid attended and graduated from the University of California at Riverside, but then decided to relocate to the other side of the country and enrolled as a graduate student at Trenton State College in Ewing Township. Sigrid was pursuing a master's degree there in music and education as she aspired to become a music teacher. Even though she was described as being a nice person who had her fair share of friends, Sigrid was known for being very independent and often hitchhiked and backpacked around the country alone. She did not have a boyfriend at this particular time, and as far as anyone knew, Sigrid did not seem to have much of an interest in dating. To close off the summer of 1977, Sigrid embarked on a hitchhiking trip through Nova Scotia and New York, and by the time Labor Day weekend rolled around, she was days away from starting the fall semester at Trenton State College. Sigrid had previously rented a room from one of the college's professors, but for the upcoming semester, she has arranged to rent a room at the residence of a volunteer firefighter who lives in Ewing Township with his family. Shortly before 11:30 p.m. on the evening of Sunday, September the 4th, a Trenton State campus police officer named Thomas Cocatello was performing a patrol of the campus grounds when he noticed a green bicycle chained to a railing next to the side entrance stairs of Kendall Hall, the college's theater building. Cocatello was certain he had seen the same bicycle there the previous evening, and when he radioed dispatch, they confirmed that no one was supposed to be in Kendall Hall on that particular night. This prompted Cocatello to enter the building by unlocking the side door, and he eventually headed towards the main stage theater. The building's lights were off, as Cocatello said that the only illumination was from the red exit signs. When Cocatello walked inside main stage theater, he noticed what appeared to be a figure lying on the stage beneath a large white sheet. When Cocatello went for a closer look, he was horrified to discover that the sheet was covering the nude body of a young woman who was face down in a large pool of blood. This prompted Cocatello to radio for backup, and the campus police and the Ewing Police Department soon arrived at the scene. Since the theater's lighting system was difficult to operate, the police had to contact the campus's electrician in order to turn on the lights and illuminate the crime scene. It turned out there was a large amount of blood on the victim's head, and she had been bludgeoned so badly that she was virtually unrecognizable. A small studio piano was located on stage about 4 feet from the victim's body, and a pile of clothing, a pair of shoes, a backpack, and a sleeping bag were found next to it. Since the backpack contained a driver's license, the authorities were able to use it to identify the victim as Sigrid Stevenson. $7 in cash and several American Express traveler's checks were found inside Sigrid's wallet, so robbery did not appear to be the motive for her murder. Since there were traces of blood underneath the piano and blood spatter on the sheet music, it appeared that Sigrid may have been in the midst of practicing before she was attacked by her assailant. There were also streaks of blood on the stage, and a broken earring and a scarf which belonged to Sigrid were lying in a separate pool of blood near her body, which suggested that after the initial attack, Sigrid attempted to make a run for it before the assailant struck her again. Sigrid's red blouse was tied around her mouth in what may have been an attempt by the killer to muffle her screaming. It turned out that the white sheet, partially wrapped around Sigrid's body, was a piano cover, but oddly, it did not belong to the piano located on stage. It was actually the cover for a $10,000 grand piano, which was kept inside the concert room of Bray Hall, another building located about 75 yards away from Kendall Hall. Sigrid's autopsy was performed by the Mercer County Deputy Medical Examiner, Dr. Rafat Ahmad, who found a number of lacerations on Sigrid's face and the back of her head. Sigrid's nose was broken, and she had 2 fractured ribs, as well as bruises on her chest, elbows, back, and thighs. Dr. Ahmad determined that the cause of death was cranial cerebral trauma to the head and massive blood loss, as Sigrid had repeatedly been beaten with a blunt object. For years, there was confusion about whether or not Sigrid was the victim of a sexual assault, as much of the contemporary reporting stated that she had not been raped. However, Dr. Ahmad was interviewed during the Unsolved Mysteries episode and confirmed that based on the amount of bruising on her pelvic area, there was a good chance that Sigrid was sexually assaulted. When Ahmad performed a vaginal swab, she did not find any live sperm, but did discover some dead sperm heads. Based on the rigor mortis and the lividity on Sigrid's body, Dr. Ahmad estimated that she had been murdered sometime between 7:30 and 10 p.m. on September the 4th, only a few hours before she was discovered. Even though an extensive search was performed, the murder weapon was never found. One possible theory was that Sigrid could have been bludgeoned by a wooden 2x4, which was ordinarily used to prop open the piano on stage, but was conspicuously absent when her body was found. For the longest time, there was contradictory reporting about whether Sigrid's hands were bound when she was discovered, but it's recently been confirmed that they were not, though symmetrical ligature marks were found on Sigrid's wrists. An interrupted pattern of blood was on the right side of Sigrid's back, which indicated that her hands may have been cuffed behind her at some point before the killer removed the cuffs and left the scene with them. Based on the bloody smear marks on the stage, it was theorized that the killer may have been planning to wrap Sigrid's body in the piano cover and transport her to another location, but changed their mind after moving her a few feet. Even though the perpetrator likely would have been covered in blood when they left Kendall Hall, no one reported seeing anything unusual that night, and surprisingly, the killer somehow managed to avoid leaving any footprints or fingerprints behind. Of course, the bicycle chained outside the building belonged to Sigrid, and investigators attempted to trace her movements in the days preceding her death. Like I mentioned earlier, Sigrid had returned from a backpacking trip and was planning to spend the semester living in a room she had rented at the residence of a volunteer firefighter in Ewing Township. However, it turned out that the firefighter and his family had left on vacation for Labor Day weekend, and since Sigrid had no other place to stay, she decided to travel to campus and crash at Kendall Hall. Sigrid had actually spent some time staying there during the previous semester, as even though the building was locked when Thomas Cocoteo discovered her body, it contained a faulty back door which did not lock properly and was easy to force open, so Sigrid likely used it to access Kendall Hall at the start of the weekend. On the evening of Saturday, September the 3rd, a local theater group consisting of 16 people showed up at Kendall Hall to put on a performance of the Archibald MacLeish authored play, J.B., in the building's Black Box Theater, located right next to the main stage theater. At around 7 p.m., a cast member from the play named Chuck went into the actor's green room beneath the stage, and when he turned on the lights, he discovered that Sigrid was sleeping on the couch. She was startled awake and told some of the other cast members that she had been spending the weekend staying in the green room and passed the time by practicing the piano in the main stage theater. Sigrid was invited to stay and watch the play, and the performance started at 8 o'clock in front of an audience of about 30 people. At the end of the play's first act, one of the cast members had a conversation with Sigrid and said that she seemed to be in a friendly, talkative mood. However, when they spoke again later that evening at around 9:30, Sigrid appeared to be in a more downbeat mood, as she stated that she had just lost an argument with a man, though she did not reveal who it was or provide any specific details. After the play ended, most of the cast members left to attend a party. At around 11:30 p.m., Sigrid told one of the actresses that she was going to remain in Kendall Hall and keep practicing the piano, but after they parted ways, this turned out to be the last time that Sigrid was confirmed to be alive. Investigators checked a diary that Sigrid had been carrying, and her last entry read, quote, "It's 11:43 p.m. They're breaking down the stage and they're going to turn the lights out, and it's going to be dark here in Kendall Hall," end quote. Sigrid also wrote that the noise was bothering her because she needed to sleep, as she was planning to practice the piano early the next morning and had to leave by 11 a.m. because that was when the guard usually came by. While Sigrid was believed to have been murdered sometime on the evening of Sunday, September the 4th, her whereabouts during the course of the day are unknown. Some of the earliest media coverage reported that an acquaintance of Sigrid's had seen her at a movie theater that day, located about 15 miles from campus, but I'm not sure if this was ever confirmed, and there are no other witnesses who reported seeing or interacting with her on the 4th. Throughout the course of the original investigation, around 100 people were interviewed, including all the campus police officers who were employed by Trenton State College at that time. As you might recall, Sigrid had some ligature marks on her wrists, which were likely from handcuffs, and she also had some long cylindrical strike marks on her back, which may have been caused by a nightstick or a baton. And of course, since campus police officers carried both these items, there was speculation that one of them might be the killer. Prior to her death, the campus police were already pretty familiar with Sigrid, as during the previous semester, there were numerous incidents where some of the officers caught her inside buildings where she wasn't supposed to be. In addition, the piano cover found on Sigrid's body had originated from the concert room at Bray Hall, which was always kept locked since it contained expensive musical instruments. There were no signs of forced entry at the building, and as far as anyone could tell, the only individuals who always carried keys to Kendall Hall, Bray Hall, and the concert room were campus police officers. At the time, Trenton State College employed 15 of these officers, and most of them consented to polygraphs, which they either wound up passing or generating inconclusive results. All of the officers' handcuffs and nightsticks were taken to the New Jersey State Police lab for testing, and while one nightstick contained traces of blood, the blood type did not match Sigrid, and the officer who carried it claimed that the blood likely belonged to another student who had cut their wrist on a window in an unrelated incident. In the end, no forensic evidence was found on any of these items to indicate that they were used during the murder. The only two campus police officers who were on duty on the night Sigrid's body was found were Thomas Cocatello and another man. While they both passed polygraphs, the second man allegedly confessed to Sigrid's murder during a conversation with another officer in the locker room a couple months later. While the other officer initially figured that he was joking, this guy also apparently had a reputation for being mean to women while he was drinking and partying, so the officer ultimately decided to inform detectives about this so-called confession. But it's unclear how thoroughly the officer was investigated, since there is no mention of his comments in any of the documentation of his original police interview. There was another officer who drew some suspicion because he decided to show up at campus headquarters to do some paperwork at around 12:30 p.m. on September the 4th, several hours before Sigrid's body was found, even though he was off duty that day and had no reason to be there. But once again, this officer was interviewed and passed a polygraph. Investigators also explored the possibility that Sigrid's killer was a member of the theater group who performed at Kendall Hall on the night before the murder, as they would have known that she would be there alone. One of the cast members was a man named Sidney Porcelain, who personally knew Sigrid and was looked at as a potential suspect, though he was ultimately ruled out since he had an ironclad alibi. But Porcelain also happened to be a self-proclaimed psychic who had helped law enforcement on previous cases, so he volunteered to lend his services to the investigation into Sigrid's murder. This involved Porcelain touching some of Sigrid's personal belongings, which would supposedly give off vibrations and allow him to experience psychic visions, but I'm sure it won't shock you to hear that this did not lead to him providing the police with any useful information. The authorities were particularly interested in Chuck, the cast member who had found Sigrid sleeping in the actor's green room, as Sigrid had a playbill in her possession in which she had circled Chuck's name and wrote, quote, "Nice man, gave me a beer," underneath it. Most intriguingly, Chuck's character in the play was a security officer who had handcuffs and a baton as props, so investigators wondered if these items could have been used on Sigrid during the course of her murder. It's unclear if they collected any of these props or performed any forensic testing on them, but after Chuck was interviewed and wound up passing a polygraph, he was no longer a focus of the investigation. Sadly, the Stevenson family would suffer an additional tragedy in November of 1979 when Ingrid's father Peter and two employees he worked with at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory flew to Camp Mercury in Nevada to film a movie on nuclear facilities. After the filming was completed, Peter, who was 55 at the time, and his two fellow employees wound up being killed when the Cessna 182 plane they were flying back to California crashed in the Altamont Pass area during bad weather. As for Ingrid's mother Barbara, she would pass away in June of 2006 at the age of 82. The investigation into Ingrid's murder reached a standstill, and the case completely faded from the spotlight, but it eventually captured the attention of Scott Napolitano, a freshman film student attending the former Trenton State College, which was officially renamed the College of New Jersey in 1996. Napolitano originally learned about the case during a campus ghost tour in 2002, as he was informed that a murder had once taken place at Kendall Hall. Since there were reports of unexplained paranormal activity in the building, such as the sound of someone playing the piano when there was no one there, it was rumored to be haunted by the victim's ghost. The tour guide never shared any specific details about the murder, not even the victim's name, but by his senior year, Napolitano became intrigued enough to start doing research into the crime, and it became the subject of his thesis film. Following graduation, Napolitano started communicating with law enforcement and interviewing people associated with this case, and investigating Sigrid Stevenson's murder pretty much became his passion project. The newfound interest prompted the Ewing PD to reopen the investigation, and over the course of the next 2 decades, it would pass through the hands of a number of cold case detectives. While DNA testing was not a thing back in 1977, some of the physical evidence from the case, including the original vaginal swabs, were finally submitted to the state police's crime lab. They were able to recover some partial DNA profiles from the evidence, but the sample sizes were too small to make a comparison to any suspects. In 2011, Napolitano was posting about the case on a number of New Jersey-based internet message boards in order to seek new information when he was contacted by a woman named Susie Banks, who was convinced that her former boyfriend was responsible for Sigrid's murder. Now, if you go to the Unsolved Mysteries subreddit, which I'm always referencing, you'll find a post which was created about this case about 6 years ago, and the top featured comment was left there by a poster under the username Susie's World. It read, quote, "The man that killed her, I am positive, was my ex-boyfriend, Charles Farrington, but he was known as Charles Judkins then. He's dead now, thank God. The police know about him even now, and he was a suspect back then. Now that the prick is dead, I feel I can say it out loud finally, so stop speculating. He did it. I'm 99.9% sure." End quote. Well, as you probably figured out, Susie's World turned out to be Susie Banks, and her ex-boyfriend, Charles Judkins/Farrington, was Chuck, the theater group member I mentioned earlier. Susie began a relationship with Chuck in 1987 and moved in with him, but he wound up being violent and abusive, and at one point, he supposedly said to her, quote, "I could kill you and get away with it. I've done it before." Their relationship eventually ended, and Chuck passed away in May of 2016 at the age of 59. Even though previous forensic testing had failed to turn up a substantial amount of DNA evidence, new testing would be performed on Sigrid's blouse, which had been wrapped around her mouth when her body was found. A couple of knots had been tied in the blouse, and testing revealed that they contained what appeared to be samples of the killer's skin cells, which contained enough usable DNA to develop a partial male profile. By the time this was done, Chuck was already deceased, but arrangements were made to obtain a DNA sample from Chuck's brother. When it was compared to the DNA from the skin cells from Sigrid's blouse, the results showed no genetic match, so Chuck was ruled out as a suspect. The case would be featured on an episode of the Netflix reboot of Unsolved Mysteries titled Murder Center Stage, which dropped on July the 31st, 2024, and featured interviews with a trio of retired Ewing police detectives who had each worked on the investigation over the previous 2 decades: Edward Dabosky, Patrick Holt, and Julia Caldwell. In 2022, Caldwell had been forced to take an early medical retirement due to an injury she suffered in the line of duty while rescuing a dog from a burning building. But during her Unsolved Mysteries interview, Caldwell revealed that during the course of her investigation, she had narrowed down her list of potential suspects to 2 men who are both still alive today. Neither of these men have ever been named publicly, but one of them was the lighting technician on the production of JB, which was performed in Kendall Hall the night before Sigrid's murder. You might recall that the main stage theater's lights were off when Sigrid's body was found, and the police had a difficult time getting them turned back on while processing the crime scene. Since the theater's lighting system was not easy to operate, Caldwell felt that the killer would have needed knowledge of the system and the building's infrastructure in order to turn them off, and of course, the lighting technician likely had these qualifications. One witness claimed that the lighting technician's mood seemed to drastically change around the time of the play, and while he was being questioned by police, he was asked if he had keys to Kendall Hall and replied no. Well, following this answer, one of the detectives immediately noticed that the technician had these keys on his key ring, but even though he had been caught in a lie, he was pretty much dismissed as a suspect after passing a polygraph. Caldwell's second potential suspect was a campus maintenance worker who also had keys to Kendall Hall and was personally acquainted with Sigrid. This man's address and phone number were found in Sigrid's possessions, and numerous witnesses, including some campus police officers, recalled having seen them together. While it's unclear what type of relationship they had, the maintenance man apparently went out of his way to let Sigrid into buildings on campus where she wasn't supposed to be. Shortly after Ingrid's murder, the maintenance worker was fired by the college, and since he had substance abuse issues, he later went into a detox program. Of course, it's possible this man would have known that Sigrid would be alone in Kendall Hall on the night she was killed, but it doesn't look like he was treated as a serious suspect during the original investigation, and he was never asked to take a polygraph. On September the 4th of last year, shortly after the release of the Unsolved Mysteries episode, a bouquet of flowers in a jar was left on the steps of Kendall Hall to commemorate the 47-year anniversary of Sigrid's death, and it had a note taped on it which read, quote, "For Sigrid Stevenson, the stage is forever your world. Rest in peace. January the 24th, 1952 to September the 4th, 1977. End quote. Shortly thereafter, the College of New Jersey announced that they were dedicating a piano practice room in their music building to Sigrid, and a plaque showcasing her name would be installed outside the entrance. Around the same time, the State Attorney General's Cold Case Network publicly announced that they were going to be performing a new investigation, as the case had been jointly submitted to them by the College of New Jersey and the Ewing Police 2 years earlier. There definitely appears to be an active effort to solve this crime, but the murder of Sigrid Stevenson continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So I remember first learning about this case several years ago, as there were a number of different posts about it at the Unsolved Mysteries subreddit. Last January, several months before the release of the Unsolved Mysteries episode, Stephen Pacheco also put together an episode about Sigrid Stevenson's murder for the Trace Evidence podcast, but for the longest time, this was a story in which the paranormal aspects, such as the alleged hauntings by Sigrid's ghost at Kendall Hall, seemed to overshadow the factual details of the crime. Like I mentioned earlier, Scott Napolitano first learned about this case during a campus ghost tour in the early 2000s, and at the time, it almost sounded like an urban legend rather than a real case, as the victim's name was never mentioned, and depending on who was telling it, you would often hear different versions of the story with contradictory details. If you go to newspapers.com, you'll see that even though Sigrid's murder got a decent amount of coverage in the New Jersey media back in 1977, it pretty much faded from the spotlight within a few years and languished in complete obscurity for decades until Scott Napolitano took an interest in it and started performing his own deep dive. During one interview last year, Napolitano stated, quote, "It bothers me that she's been forgotten, that she's been turned into a ghost story because she had a life. I feel really bad that your whole life can get turned into an entirely different narrative and that's how you're remembered. So that's why I stayed with it, because I care about the truth, and the truth has been lost, and that in some cases, actively changed to make it for a more entertaining story." End quote. Law enforcement eventually launched a cold case investigation, and the story started getting coverage again in some New Jersey-based publications before it finally attained national exposure on the Unsolved Mysteries Netflix reboot. When I heard this case was going to be featured on an episode of the series, I was pleasantly surprised, but I was also a bit cynical, since I figured they might gravitate towards the paranormal angle and spend most of their time focusing on the alleged hauntings at Kendall Hall. But thankfully, the paranormal stuff turned out to be a complete non-factor in the episode's presentation, as it focused exclusively on the victim and the details of the crime, and shared a lot of new information which had never been made public before. One thing which struck me about the episode is the amount of people who were interviewed and seemed to genuinely care about seeing Sigrid receive justice, even though they didn't learn about her story until decades after she was killed. This included Scott Napolitano and a number of the retired cold case detectives who have worked on this case over the years, including Julia Caldwell, Patrick Holt, and Edward Dubosky, who actually breaks down in tears at one point when he talks about Sigrid. You could criticize the case's original investigators for making mistakes and not being as thorough as they should have been, but it's clear that these 3 detectives really wanted it to be solved. The episode also contained an interview with Thomas Cocatello, the campus police officer who discovered Sigrid's body. Cocatello was only 22 years old at the time and went on to have his own distinguished career in law enforcement, but you can tell that he is also still haunted by the crime. It definitely sounds like Sigrid has a lot of advocates in her corner, though sadly, both of her parents have passed away, and from what I can tell, her other family members, including her sister Sylvia, have never publicly spoken about the case and have elected to maintain their privacy. However, Sigrid's supporters have done a great job advocating for her these past several years, because if you look at the original press coverage from the time of her murder, she was painted as something of a quirky loner who liked to march to the beat of her own drummer. I always find it haunting when I search through newspaper archives and find articles in which a victim is quoted or mentioned in connection to an unrelated topic before they went missing or were murdered. If you go to newspapers.com and perform a search on Sigrid's name, you'll find an article about a meeting of the New Jersey State Legislature, which was published in the April 29, 1977 edition of the Newark-based newspaper, the Star-Ledger. Sigrid was in attendance at this meeting and was quoted in the article as saying, quote, "There's too much talking and joking. The last time I was here, the bill that got the biggest debate was one to decide whether barbershops could also become haberdashers. I said, this is what they argue about here?" End quote. So it's quite haunting to think that she would be brutally murdered just 4 months after she said that. Comparisons have often been made between this crime and the 1974 murder of Arliss Perry, a 19-year-old student at Stanford University in California who was brutally killed on campus inside Stanford Memorial Church. For decades, there were so many wild theories surrounding Arliss's death, including the possibility that she was the victim of a satanic cult which was connected to David Berkowitz and the Son of Sam murders. But in 2018, genetic genealogy linked DNA evidence from the crime to Stephen Crawford, the campus security guard who discovered her body, and he wound up fatally shooting himself when police showed up at his door to arrest him. Naturally, there's been speculation that Sigrid was also murdered by a campus police officer, and given what happened with Arliss Perry, I suppose it's not surprising that online sleuths have continued to cast suspicion towards Thomas Cocatello, the officer who found Sigrid's body. But it sounds like Cocatello was ruled out as a suspect relatively quickly, and when you consider that he went on to have a distinguished career in law enforcement, and clearly still seemed to be haunted by his experience during his Unsolved Mysteries interview, I see no reason to believe that he did this, though I wouldn't rule out the possibility of another campus police officer being responsible. What we do know for certain is that the last confirmed sighting of Sigrid while she was alive took place at about 11:30 p.m. on Saturday, September the 4th, when she was seen in Kendall Hall by cast members from that evening's production of JB. Her body was found there by Cocatello about 24 hours later, but the deputy medical examiner believed that she was killed only a few hours beforehand, sometime between 7:30 and 10 p.m. that night. During Sigrid's final entry in her diary, she wrote that she was going to practice the piano that morning and likely leave before the guard stopped by to check the building at 11 a.m. However, it's never been publicly confirmed if a guard actually checked the building that morning, and what's odd is that we do not seem to have any confirmed sightings of Sigrid at all on September the 4th. The earliest press coverage reported that an acquaintance of Sigrid's had seen her that day at a movie theater located 15 miles from campus, but since this sighting isn't mentioned in more recent accounts, it's possible the witness could have been mistaken. Another possibility is that Sigrid did leave Kendall Hall as planned on the morning of the 4th and then returned there later that evening, but if so, how many people knew she was going to be there? Other than the campus police officers performing their routine patrols, nobody was scheduled to be in that building on that particular date. It seems very likely that whoever did this had some sort of personal connection to Sigrid or the campus, because there would be no reason for a random killer to enter Kendall Hall on a Sunday night and just assume that one of the doors was unlocked and a victim was alone in there. Based on the physical evidence, it appears that Sigrid was in the midst of practicing the piano on the stage before she was attacked, and while the murder weapon was never found, I do think that the most logical theory is that the weapon might have been the wooden 2x4 ordinarily used to prop open the piano, as it was conspicuously absent from the scene. It's possible this wasn't a premeditated murder, but rather a crime of passion, in which the killer flew into a rage against Sigrid, possibly because she rejected his sexual advances or something. And if this is what happened, then it makes sense that the perpetrator never brought a murder weapon with them and just grabbed the first thing they could find at the scene to attack Sigrid. For years, one of the biggest unanswered questions in this case was whether or not Sigrid was sexually assaulted, as most of the earliest reporting stated that she was not raped, even though she was found nude, gagged with her own blouse, and likely had her hands bound behind her back with handcuffs. But when the original deputy medical examiner, Dr. Rafat Ahmad, was interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries, she finally confirmed that sexual assault may have taken place, though no live sperm was found in Sigrid's body, only some dead sperm heads. If Sigrid was murdered only a few hours before she was found, it's odd that no live sperm was present, but since she did have pelvic bruising, I'm wondering if perhaps the perpetrator did sexually penetrate her but was unable to ejaculate. For all we know, those dead sperm heads could have been the result of a consensual sexual encounter that Sigrid experienced in the days prior to her murder, and the sperm does not even belong to her killer. But since Sigrid did not have a boyfriend and seemed to have little interest in dating, this theory is based on nothing more than pure speculation. Whatever the case, there was not enough evidence on Sigrid's vaginal swab to put together a DNA profile for a suspect, so even if Sigrid was assaulted, this crime will likely have to be solved by other means. Based on the ligature marks on her wrists, it seems likely that Sigrid was handcuffed at some point before the cuffs were removed, and she had strike marks on her back to suggest that she was struck with a nightstick or a baton. Naturally, this only increased speculation that the killer was a campus police officer, since they would have been carrying both of these items. It sounds like many of the officers were already familiar with Sigrid, as they had a prior history of catching her sneaking into buildings where she wasn't supposed to be, so on the surface, it would make perfect sense if one of them knew that Sigrid would be in Kendall Hall by herself and decided to take advantage of the situation. I know that each of the officers' handcuffs and nightsticks were collected as evidence, and forensic testing found nothing to link any of these items to the murder, but they would have had ample time to clean them or remove any trace of physical evidence. You have to remember that this is 1977 forensics, when no one would have been testing them for DNA, and if more advanced testing was performed today, the results might turn out differently. Of course, we know that handcuffs and at least one baton were used as props in the production of JB, but it's unclear if these props were still in Kendall Hall at the time of Sigrid's murder, or if they were already removed by the theater group. And there also doesn't seem to be any record of law enforcement having collected these props or performing forensic testing on them. Obviously, if these items were still available in Kendall Hall when Sigrid was killed, this opens up the options for potential suspects, but I certainly wouldn't dismiss the possibility of the killer being a campus police officer. The issue is that it almost sounds like a lot of these officers are ruled out based on nothing more than the fact that they passed polygraphs, and I'm sure you all know just how unreliable polygraphs are. Some of these officers did seem like intriguing suspects, such as the guy who was on duty on the night of the crime and allegedly bragged about killing Sigrid, as well as another officer who showed up on campus on the day of the murder, even though he was not scheduled to be on duty. Even if they weren't working that night, any of the officers could have shown up to Kendall Hall with their uniform, handcuffs, and nightstick, and Sigrid wouldn't have known if it wasn't their scheduled shift. So was there definitive evidence to rule out these other guys as suspects, or was it based on nothing more than them passing polygraphs? Unfortunately, we just don't have that information. I'd be particularly interested in learning if the whereabouts of the other officer who was on duty that night were completely accounted for during his shift. Given the brutal nature of the crime, Sigrid's killer would have likely got a lot of blood on themselves, and if the officer just happened to disappear for a few hours that night and changed out of his uniform, I'm sure that should have looked awfully suspicious. So now's a good time to talk about Chuck, who was apparently going by the name Charles Judkins back in 1977, though he later changed it to Charles Farrington. I previously mentioned that Chuck's ex-girlfriend, Susie Banks, left a comment on a post about this case 6 years ago on the Unsolved Mysteries subreddit, where she directly accused him of being Sigrid's killer. Back then, I knew nothing about Chuck's background or his possible connection to the case, and of course, you should always take internet message board comments with a huge grain of salt. But the comment was still in the back of my mind when I watched the Unsolved Mysteries episode for the first time, so it was quite an eye-opening moment when Susie herself appeared on camera to be interviewed and pretty much confirmed everything she wrote. On the surface, Chuck appeared to be the perfect suspect, particularly when they revealed that he was the one who woke Sigrid up in the actor's green room the night before she was killed and was using handcuffs and a baton as props for his role in the play. It was also interesting to learn that Sigrid told one of the other cast members that she lost an argument with a man that night, which put her into a downbeat mood. We don't know if this man was Chuck, but given that Sigrid had circled his name in the playbill and wrote, quote, "Nice man, gave me a beer," it's reasonable to assume that they were hanging out and conversing that night. Perhaps they were initially getting along well before they got into some sort of dispute that later escalated into murder, which didn't seem that implausible given Chuck's documented history of violence towards Susie. However, after learning this new information, it did come as a surprise to me when the episode revealed that Chuck had pretty much been ruled out as a suspect via DNA testing. Of course, since Chuck was already deceased by that point, the DNA sample had to be collected from his brother, and I am hoping that the proper security protocols were in place to ensure that Chuck's brother didn't contaminate the DNA or do something to help cover for him. During online discussions about this case, I've seen commenters question the validity of the DNA evidence as it was taken from skin cells found on Sigrid's blouse, which was tied around her mouth. Since she spent time sleeping on a couch in the actor's green room, some people have wondered if the DNA could have belonged to another person who had been on the couch before her and had transferred to her blouse. But the skin cells were taken directly from inside the knots in the blouse, and from what I've heard, the DNA could only belong to the person who tied these knots. Another theory I've seen pushed forward is that multiple people committed this crime, and if Chuck had an accomplice, that person could have been the source of the DNA on the blouse. But overall, even though Chuck was such a compelling suspect, I'm afraid this angle is probably a dead end, and someone else was likely responsible for the murder. The fact of the matter is that there were at least 16 people in the theater group which put on the production of JB, and Chuck was not the only one who would have been aware that Sigrid was spending the weekend at Kendall Hall. And we also can't even be certain if Chuck was the man who had the argument with Sigrid that night, or if this exchange had any relevance to her murder. If the props from the play were left behind in the theater, then anyone from this group could have known where to find the handcuffs and the baton if they wanted to use them on Sigrid. An individual whom Julia Caldwell believes is one of the two most likely suspects is the lighting technician from this production, as he may have been aware that Sigrid would be alone in the building, and he was also caught in a lie by investigators when he denied having his own set of keys to Kendall Hall. The most intriguing detail which might point to this guy is the fact that the lights were off in the main stage theater when Sigrid's body was found, but the system was so difficult to operate that the police had to get an electrician to turn them back on after they arrived at the scene. So therefore, it's reasonable to assume that the technician would have been one of the very few people with the expertise to turn the lights off after killing Sigrid. But here's the thing. How can we even be certain the lights were on when the crime took place? Remember, the production of JB did not take place in the main stage theater, but in the adjacent Black Box Theater, and since no performances were taking place in the main stage theater that weekend, would there be any reason for the lights to be on at all? The theater was very dark at the time Sigrid's body was discovered, but it obviously couldn't have been like that the entire weekend if she was practicing the piano on stage, and I have my doubts that Sigrid would have known how to operate the lighting system herself. I know that Kendall Hall has been heavily renovated and remodeled these past few decades, but when I look at current photographs of the main stage theater, it does have windows with blinds which could provide illumination during the daytime. So if Sigrid was murdered while there was still light outside, the killer wouldn't have needed to turn the stage lights on. But of course, Dr. Ahmad estimated that the murder took place between 7:30 and 10 p.m., so if it was dark inside the theater and the only illumination was from the exit signs, it would have been difficult for the killer to operate and be cautious enough not to leave any fingerprints or footprints behind. I suppose the killer could have turned the lights on, and given the limited amount of people who would have known how to operate the system, I could go either way on the lighting technician. Once again, it's been reported that he passed a polygraph, but I hope that the original investigators didn't rule him out based solely on that. The other potential suspect pushed forward by Detective Caldwell was a maintenance man who was apparently acquainted with Sigrid and would let her into buildings where she wasn't supposed to be, and he also got fired by the college for substance abuse issues shortly after the murder took place. And unlike many of the other potential suspects in this case, it doesn't look like he was asked to take a polygraph or was thoroughly investigated at all. If this guy was aware that Sigrid would be alone in Kendall Hall that weekend and in a very vulnerable position, then he definitely seems like a compelling suspect, but unfortunately, we know very little about his background, and I have no idea of his whereabouts on the night of the crime, or if he could be placed on campus. One thing that the maintenance man and many of the other suspects in this case have in common is that they supposedly possessed keys to Kendall Hall during that time period, but the reason Sigrid was able to access the building in the first place was because it had a faulty back door which did not lock properly and was easy to force open. This was apparently an open secret on campus, so even if a suspect did not have a key, that doesn't necessarily mean they couldn't have made it inside Kendall Hall that night. But on the other hand, if the killer was a campus police officer, they could have used a key to access the building and then locked the door behind them when they left, since Thomas Cocatello said he had to unlock the door when he walked inside and found Sigrid's body. The lack of forced entry really does suggest that the perpetrator either had a key or enough knowledge of the facility to be aware of the faulty back door. However, the one piece of evidence which I believe really complicates this case is the piano cover found on Sigrid, as it was ordinarily used to cover a grand piano inside the concert room of Bray Hall, an entirely separate building. It's been theorized that the killer used the cover to wrap Sigrid's body because they were originally intending to transport her out of the building and possibly dispose of her at another location, but then they changed their mind and decided to just leave her body on the stage. So if this theory is correct, does this mean that the perpetrator committed the crime, left the building to grab the piano cover from Bray Hall, and then returned to Kendall Hall? Once again, if that is what happened, then this means they had to have a lot of knowledge and familiarity of the campus and the buildings, because an outsider isn't going to know where to find that piano cover. However, unlike Kendall Hall, it sounds like Bray Hall and the concert room were very secure and locked up tight, and the only people who had keys to all three locations at that time were the campus police officers. And if this is true, then this would seemingly rule out the maintenance man, the lighting technician, or anyone else from the theater group as being the killer. But can we be absolutely certain that this piano cover was not moved out of Bray Hall on a previous occasion and was already in Kendall Hall on the night of the murder? If by chance, someone brought it into the main stage theater for the purpose of, say, covering up the studio piano, and it just happened to be lying around there when the murder took place, then this could explain why the killer grabbed it and used it to cover Sigrid's body. And if he didn't require a key to access Bray Hall, then this only increases the pool of potential suspects. Following the release of the Unsolved Mysteries episode, the Times of Trenton newspaper published another article about the case containing comments from Scott Napolitano, Edward Dubosky, and Julia Caldwell, who revealed that they often get into friendly arguments about their differing theories. Caldwell still believes that the lighting technician and the maintenance man are the two best suspects, whereas Napolitano and Dubosky still lean towards the killer being a campus police officer. And I guess this just goes to show you how some of the evidence in this case can be interpreted in different ways. For instance, if the piano cover was taken from Bray Hall on the night of the murder, then you'd think the killer would have to be a campus police officer, but if it was already in Kendall Hall beforehand, then the killer could be anybody. If the stage lights were turned on and off that night, then you'd assume that the killer would have to be the lighting technician, but if the lights were not used at all, then the possibilities are endless. But just because someone passed a polygraph back in 1977 does not mean they should be completely ruled out as a suspect. With the information we have now, it sounds like there are compelling little details which could point to each potential suspect, but not enough to conclusively implicate any of them. And for each suspect, there are other compelling little details which seem to point away from them. For years, it seemed like the most intriguing suspect was Chuck, but then DNA testing ruled him out, and I'd be curious to know if any attempt has been made to compare the DNA profile from the blouse to any of the other potential suspects, such as the lighting technician, the maintenance man, the on-duty campus police officer, or any of the other officers who were employed there at that time. I'd also love to see this DNA profile get submitted into some databases for the purposes of genetic genealogy, as this could potentially link evidence to someone who has never popped up on the radar as a suspect. I know that modern-day investigators have always been shocked at how little physical evidence actually exists in this case, as even though this was a brutal crime in which the victim was fatally bludgeoned and blood wound up everywhere, the perpetrator somehow managed to avoid leaving any fingerprints or footprints at the scene. They also may have attempted sexual assault without leaving behind any DNA, and the only forensic evidence we have to work with are the skin cells found in the knots of Sigrid's blouse, which no one would have been thinking of back in 1977. But was the lack of physical evidence the result of the killer being incredibly skilled, or just incredibly lucky? If this murder was not pre-planned, then I'd say the latter scenario was more likely, as there were also no smears in the blood to indicate that the killer had attempted to clean up after themselves. If this crime was committed today, and law enforcement had modern forensics at their disposal, it's possible they would have solved this relatively quickly. Even so, modern forensics have proven that no crime is truly unsolvable, and we've seen many cold cases older than this one wind up getting solved these past several years. I know that the Unsolved Mysteries reboot has drawn some criticism for covering cases involving mysterious deaths, which may not have been crimes at all, but they definitely knocked it out of the park with their coverage of Sigrid Stevenson's murder, as they provided the most complete account of this story to date and introduced it to a wider audience. This case is definitely a major whodunit, but I know that some of the potential suspects are still alive, and it's not too late to bring them to justice if they can be conclusively linked to this crime. So if you happen to have any information about the murder of Sigrid Stevenson, please contact the Mercer County Homicide Task Force at 609-989-6406. That's 609-989-6406. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7 years, our Patreon page has released over 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about the unsolved disappearances of Jack Quinn and Philip Breen, a pair of fugitives profiled on Unsolved Mysteries who were wanted for committing financial crimes but were never caught and are still fugitives to this day. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss the 1976 murders of James Freund and Pamela Buckley, who used to be a pair of unidentified decedents known only as the Sumter County Does. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 70 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon these past few weeks, and they are Zachary M., Quinn M., Helen L., Lindsay D., Becca Lynn, and Claire. Thank you all so much for your support. I also wanted to mention that in just under 1 month, The Trail Went Cold will be appearing on Podcast Row at the True Crime Podcast Festival, which is taking place in Boston, Massachusetts at the Doubletree by Hilton Hotel, Boston North Shore, from July the 18th to the 20th. If you would like to purchase tickets, we have a specialized promo code you can use to get a 20% discount on them. So please visit truecrimepodcastfestival.com and use the promo code ROBIN20 to get 20% off tickets. Once again, visit truecrimepodcastfestival.com and the promo code is ROBIN20 for 20% off. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, which has a lot of interesting discussions about today's featured case. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.